Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today we're going to look at what I'm going to call the real parable of David French. And what we have to see is that David French has been going back and forth on whether or not he's going to affirm same-sex unions. And we're going to look briefly at what he means by that. But before we do, what I want to do is I just want to encourage you to do a couple of things. First of all, if you have not subscribed to this podcast, we're starting to see a little bit of growth, but I need your help. And in fact, if you're watching this, please subscribe, like, and share this podcast. It really helps us put out more information like this so that we can continue to evaluate apologetic related issues for evangelical Christians through this platform. So anything you can do to help, I really appreciate it. The second one is this. We actually have a very exciting conference coming up next week. It's going to be in Phoenix, Arizona, and we are dealing with this topic of mere simulacrity, which is this idea of living in a hyper-real, digital, yet non-real society. And we'll flesh out more about what that means, but if you are in the area, please come out. We're going to be at Redeemer Bible Church, and there's going to be some key figures there, and we're going to address some major issues. Some of those figures are going to be Charlie Kirk, James Lindsay. You'll see Michael O'Fallon. You'll see the pastor of the church, John Benzinger, and myself, and a few others. And it's going to be a 3-day conference, and we're going to look at issues related to the new religion of social justice. And I'm going to be addressing topics related to hermeneutics and perspectivalism. And I'm going to be answering the question in particular, are we doomed to hermeneutical nihilism? So I'm not going to give away any more, but if you're interested, go and Google it, Mere Simulacrity, Phoenix, Arizona, next week. Now, as we start to dive into this topic, we realize that American evangelicals are really at a crossroads over the issue of religious freedom and the notion of same-sex unions or same-sex marriage. In my opinion, they're going to function the same way. There's really a difference without much of a distinction within them. But the real debate has come down to is that for no short of saying it the way that it actually is, David French has come out and argued in favor of same-sex unions. In fact, we're also going to look at the fact that the Gospel Coalition seems to have bought into this idea that we can bifurcate this traditional definition of marriage, and yet this idea that we can have same-sex unions as some type of civil suit for people to pursue. Now, I think that's an interesting topic in and of itself. And what I want to do is I want to bring up a series of articles to help us understand what's going on with this. So first of all, I want to bring up this first one that was put out by Albert Mohler. And in this article, he titles it The Parable of David French. This is how conservatism dies, and this is how marriage is surrendered. Now, all in all, I will actually say that I agree with the major thrust of Dr. Mohler's article here. I think that what we're finding is that David French is flip-flopping on the issue, and that's where the so-called parable of David French is coming about. But I'm going to say there's an even bigger parable. Just wait to the end as we start to discuss this. And he lays out a lot of the history of this debate. Much of it is beyond our time, or worthy of our time here today to actually look into it. But what I want us to look at is this last section here where Dr. Mohler is talking about this last little paragraph. He says, one of the most perplexing marks of our time is the defection of so-called many conservatives from the cause of conserving what Russell Kirk called the permanent things. If marriage is not conserved, if civil marriage is not conserved as a man-woman union, then nothing genuinely conservative can last, at least for long. Support for the Respect for Marriage Act is bad enough. The way David French frames his argument is worse. this is how conservatism dies, and this is how marriage is surrendered. And when you read this, Mohler's absolutely correct in his evaluation, where he's talking about so-called conservatives and how we need to defend the permanent things. Marriage is not just a religious thing, it's a created order thing. It's not just a government issue. It's, like we've said, it's a created order issue. Now, does it have government overlap and does it have religious overlap? You better believe it. But the point that we have to see here is that if we can somehow make these bifurcations in our mind, that these permanent things aren't transcendental in the sense of touching both the government, the religious sphere, and sort of the created ordinance, we're going to see the degradation of marriage in all of those different spheres. And that's why Mohler is right when he says this: if marriage is not conserved, if civil marriage is not conserved as a man-woman union, then nothing genuinely conservative can last, at least for long. And people might be able to say, in theory, it can last for a while, but with the Respect for Marriage Act, I think we're going to be pressed more than we've ever seen on this issue of religious freedom and the issue of the sexual rights or the sexual equality movement that's taken place within the West. That's why he says here, the way David French frames his argument is worse. This is how conservatism dies, and this is how marriage is surrendered. In fact, this is how the church compromises. Now, bear with me here, because I want to pull up a second article. It's going to take me actually pulling it up in the specifics here. And this is a second article that has come out from the Gospel Coalition. And now, as many of you know, the Gospel Coalition is an organization that has progressively moved left on several issues. And unfortunately, this article by Joe Carter is a reflection of that trend within the Gospel Coalition. Now, he gives this article, Simple Solution to Same-Sex Civil Marriage, and he puts it in quotation marks. And one of the things that he's trying to say is that we don't have to redefine what we mean by marriage, but we need to make place and make room for this idea of civil unions. And he lays out, again, a lot of the history of this debate and what he considers the specific issues. And he builds some of his argument around this five-legged dog of marriage law. And as he says here, if you recall a dog's tail, if you call a dog's tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? 5, his audience would invariably answer no. He'd politely respond, the correct answer is 4. Calling a tail a leg does not make it a leg. And what he starts to argue for is that just because we call something marriage doesn't make it a marriage. Now, in that simple sense, Carter is right. Just because we redefine something to include whatever we want to include with it doesn't mean that the actual essence, reality of the thing has been changed. But what's of interest here is that he starts to accommodate his views to many of the conclusions argued for by David French. Now, one thing that he does is different is that he points to this issue of Ruth's solution to the problem. And what he's trying to argue for is that we're left with these social situations where if we don't have some kind of civil unions, then people are left with hardships, whether it be with Ruth and Naomi, or what he might say is a nephew and maybe a disabled uncle. But the point that he's trying to get at here is that as he's arguing here, he's claiming that figures within Focus on the Family and broader evangelicalism have not always been opposed to this notion of civil same-sex unions. And what he tries to argue for down at the bottom is, let's find it here. It says, similarly, the government also can't create relationships in which two adults agree to take care of one another, but when stripped of any sexual connotation and reserved for a two-person dependent commitment relationship, the state should recognize their value and make it easier and not harder for modern-day Ruths. In short, the point that he's trying to argue for is really his agreement with David French's approach. Now, he may nuance it in different ways, but the general thrust of the argument is that he is arguing that civil unions is are something that evangelicals and really just society as a whole should embrace. So as we come to this, what I want to return to is this idea and really a play on the parable of David French. And I want to lay this before you. Is the real parable of David French the fact that he's flip-flopped on marriage? Because in that sense, we could also say there's the big parable of the Gospel Coalition where it's flip-flopping on its definition of marriage. So the issue of the parable, they'll say, is the big flip-flop. But I think there's an even deeper parable. I think there's even something more important for us to look at and to consider just very briefly. And it's really almost by raising a question. Is the real parable the fact that David French has flip-flopped on marriage? Or is the real parable the fact that evangelicals have platformed him for so long and not really understood his real views? He's been clear about some of his trajectories over the years. But the interesting thing is that there are several evangelical schools who have platformed French. He gives the key spring lectures at Southeastern. He's interviewed at Southern. He's been platformed with the Gospel Coalition. In many respects, he's been seen as a key thought leader within evangelicalism. But now, when he tries to make this distinction without a real difference between civil unions and same-sex marriage, we as evangelicals have to respond and say with very strong words that a rose by any other name is still a rose. And a difference without a distinction is that same kind of rose. But what's not so rosy in this picture is the fact that evangelicals have been caught in their very own parable. Namely, why is it the person that you're now critiquing is the individual that you have platformed for so long? So what the call for us is to do is this. We need to respond to the David French situation, not by just decrying David French. Rather, we need to respond to our religious leaders because, again, they were the proverbial watchmen. They knew what was going on. They're not unaware of these situations. Because one of the things that we find that's going on within evangelicalism is that there's almost two key issues. There's the massive sort of group think that takes place. And two, there's this on-off switch. It's almost nobody's talking about something, boom, the lights turned on. And this is precisely what's going on with David French, the social justice movement, and much, much more. So again, press your leaders on the real parable of David French, not the so-called flip-flop parable of David French. And if you get the time, please tune in next week with our conference, Mere Simulacrity, where we're going to not only look into the inconsistencies of evangelical leaders, but we're going to look at the most dominant, pressing religion against Christianity in the West.